The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, and I hurried to answer it, eager to see my son Caleb and his wife Alyssa. As I opened the door, a broad smile spread across my face, but it quickly faded when I saw the cold, hard expression on Alyssa's face. "Martha, do you really think you can just waltz into our lives like this? You're delusional if you think you're welcome here," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. I recoiled, taken aback by the sheer hostility in her words. Disbelief and anger swelled within me. How could my own son's wife speak so disrespectfully? This wasn't the sweet, caring Alyssa I had known when they first got married. Caleb stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Alyssa, what's going on? Why are you talking to my mother like that?" Alyssa shot him a withering glare. "Don't you see, Caleb? She's trying to worm her way back into our lives, just like she always does. We don't need her meddling." I opened my mouth to protest, but Caleb held up a hand, silencing me. "Mom, I'm sorry, but maybe it's best if you go home for now. We'll talk about this later." His voice was strained, caught between his allegiance to his wife and his love for his mother. Tears pricked my eyes as I nodded wordlessly and stepped back, closing the door on their retreating figures. As I leaned against the solid oak, my heart heavy, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the gentle, loving daughter-in-law I had once known. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of tension and hostility. Whenever I tried to offer a helping hand around the house, Alyssa would rebuff me with cruel remarks or outright insults. It was as if she were determined to make me feel unwelcome in my own son's home. One evening, Alyssa hosted a family dinner, and I naively thought it might be an opportunity to mend fences. But as soon as the meal began, she launched into a tirade, accusing me of spoiling the food and making a mess in the kitchen. "Honestly, Martha, can't you do anything right?" she sneered, her eyes flashing with malice. "Maybe it's time you stopped trying to be so involved in our lives." I sat there stunned into silence as Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable or unwilling to confront his wife's behavior. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward silences and forced small talk, and by the time Frank and I left, I felt utterly defeated. As the weeks turned into months, Alyssa's hostility only grew more pronounced. She would make snide comments about my cooking, criticize my appearance, and even go so far as to insult my intelligence in front of others. All the while, Caleb remained oblivious, either too wrapped up in his work or too afraid of confronting his wife to notice the rift that was tearing our family apart. As the weeks passed, Alyssa's hostility towards me only intensified. What had once been a warm, welcoming home felt more like a battleground, with every domestic chore becoming a source of conflict. One afternoon, I offered to help Alyssa with the laundry, thinking it might be a small gesture of goodwill. But as soon as I stepped into the laundry room, she rounded on me, her eyes narrowed with contempt. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, snatching the basket of clothes from my hands. "I don't need your help. You'll just mess everything up like you always do." I tried to protest, to explain that I was simply trying to lend a hand, but she cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Save it, Martha. I know what you're up to. You're trying to make me look bad in front of Caleb, like I can't handle the simplest of tasks. Well, it's not going to work. Just stay out of my way." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, stunned and hurt by the venom in her words. It wasn't just the household chores that became a battleground either. Alyssa seemed determined to make every family gathering a living hell for me. At one particularly tense dinner, she went out of her way to criticize every dish I had prepared, even going so far as to accuse me of using expired ingredients. "Honestly, Martha, is it so hard to follow a simple recipe?" she sneered, pushing her plate away with a look of disgust. "No wonder Caleb and I rarely come over for dinner. Who knows what kind of food poisoning we might get?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment as the rest of the family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Caleb, as usual, said nothing, his gaze fixed resolutely on his plate. After the meal, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Alyssa sauntered in, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "You know, Martha, maybe it's time you accepted that you're just not cut out for this whole mother-in-law thing," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're always getting in the way, trying to insert yourself where you're not wanted. It's pathetic, really." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure in the face of her cruelty. Alyssa, I don't know what I've done to deserve this kind of treatment from you, I said, my voice trembling with barely contained emotion. But this has to stop. You're tearing our family apart. She let out a cruel laugh, her eyes glinting with malice. Oh, please, don't act like you're the victim here, Martha. You're the one who's always meddling, always trying to undermine me. Well, I've got news for you. It's not going to work. I'm in charge here, and you'd better start respecting that. With that, she turned and stalked out of the kitchen, leaving me feeling more alone and helpless than ever before. As the months dragged on, it became increasingly clear that Alyssa's behavior was part of a calculated scheme to isolate me from my own family. Her manipulative tactics were subtle at first, but soon they became painfully obvious. It started with her suggestions that Frank and I should move in with them to help out around the house. At first, it seemed like a kind gesture, a way for us to spend more time with our son and grandchildren. But as the weeks passed, Alyssa's true intentions became clear. You know, Martha, it's really not fair for you and Frank to be living on your own at your age, she would say, feigning concern. You should be closer to us so we can take care of you properly. I would politely decline, assuring her that Frank and I were perfectly capable of caring for ourselves. But Alyssa was relentless, bringing it up at every opportunity until finally I agreed just to keep the peace. Little did I know, it was all part of her plan. A few months later, Caleb came to us with a proposal. Mom, Dad, Alyssa and I have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea for us to move into a bigger house, he said, a hopeful smile on his face. That way you two could come and live with us, and we could all be together as one big happy family. I should have seen the warning signs then, but I was so desperate to maintain some semblance of family unity that I agreed without hesitation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as we began searching for the perfect house. Alyssa was adamant that we find a place with enough space for all of us, promising that we would finally be able to live in harmony under one roof. But as the moving day drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Alyssa's behavior had taken on a strange, almost manic quality, and there was a glint in her eye that made me uneasy. Still, I pushed those doubts aside, determined to make the best of the situation for the sake of my son and my grandchildren. The day we finally moved into the new house should have been a joyous occasion, but it quickly became clear that Alyssa had other plans. As we unpacked our belongings and tried to settle in, she made it abundantly clear that we were unwelcome guests in our own home. I hope you don't think you're going to be able to just waltz in here and take over, she sneered, her eyes narrowed in contempt. This is my house, and you'll follow my rules. I tried to reason with her, to remind her that we were all family and that we should be able to live together in peace and harmony, but Alyssa was having none of it. Don't give me that family nonsense, she spat. You're nothing but a burden, and I'm not going to let you ruin my life anymore. As I stood there, stunned and hurt by her cruelty, Caleb simply looked on, his expression blank and impassive. It was as if he had been completely blind to his wife's true nature all along. That night, as Frank and I unpacked the last of our belongings in the small guest room Alyssa had grudgingly allocated to us, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over me. This was supposed to be a fresh start for our family, but instead it felt like the beginning of the end. The housewarming party was supposed to be a celebration of our new life together as a family. But for Alyssa, it was merely an opportunity to drive the final nail into the coffin of our once happy relationship. As guests began to arrive, bearing gifts and well wishes, Alyssa made it a point to greet each and every one of them with a warm smile and a friendly embrace. But when it came to Frank and me, she treated us like unwanted strangers, barely acknowledging our presence. Alyssa, shouldn't we go and greet Martha and Frank? Caleb asked at one point, a hint of confusion in his voice. Alyssa fixed him with a withering glare. Why bother? She snapped. They're not the ones hosting this party. They're just guests. The way she spat out that last word as if it left a bitter taste in her mouth sent a chill down my spine. It was clear that in her eyes Frank and I were nothing more than intruders in our own family. As the party wore on, Alyssa's behavior only grew more outrageous. She would intentionally exclude us from conversations or make snide remarks about our living situation whenever we tried to join in. "Oh, Martha, you're still here?" she would say, feigning surprise. "I thought you and Frank would have gone back to your room by now. Wouldn't want to overstay your welcome, would we?" Each time, I would feel my cheeks burn with humiliation, while Caleb simply stood by, doing nothing to defend us. But the final straw came when it was time to cut the cake. Alyssa had gone all out, ordering an elaborate, multi-tiered confection that must have cost a small fortune. As she gathered everyone around for the ceremonial slicing, she made a point of positioning Frank and me at the very back of the crowd, almost as if she were ashamed to be associated with us. "All right, everyone, gather round," she called out, her voice sickly sweet. "It's time to celebrate our new home and our new life together." She fixed me with a pointed stare as she said those last few words, her lips curled into a cruel smirk. As she began cutting into the cake, distributing slices to everyone except Frank and me, I felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over me. This was supposed to be a time of joy and togetherness, but Alyssa had turned it into a twisted form of torture, designed to remind us of our place in her world. Finally, when the last slice had been handed out, Alyssa turned to us, feigning surprise. "Oh, Martha, Frank, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot about you two," she said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "But I suppose it's for the best. You wouldn't want to ruin your figures with all that sugar, would you?" The laughter that rippled through the crowd was like a knife to my heart. In that moment, I realized that Alyssa had won. She had succeeded in turning our family against us, and there was nothing we could do to stop her. Tears stinging my eyes, I turned to Frank and said the words I never thought I'd have to utter. "Let's go, dear. I think it's time we left." As we made our way towards the door, I could hear Alyssa's mocking laughter ringing in my ears. But even as my heart shattered into a million pieces, a small spark of determination began to flicker within me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Alyssa may have won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And I vowed, right then and there, that I would make her pay for every ounce of disrespect and humiliation she'd heaped upon us. In the days following the housewarming party debacle, Frank and I retreated into ourselves, nursing our wounds and trying to make sense of the cruelty we had endured. But as the shock and humiliation began to fade, a new emotion took root within me, a burning desire for revenge. It was then that I remembered a crucial detail that Alyssa had been kept in the dark about all these years, the financial support I had been secretly providing Caleb. You see, my son's job as an engineer didn't pay him nearly enough to support the lavish lifestyle Alyssa had grown accustomed to. So for years, I had been funneling a portion of my retirement savings into his bank account each month, ensuring that he could keep up with her extravagant demands. And that's when the plan began to take shape. "Frank," I said one evening as we sat together in the small guest room that had become our sanctuary, "I think it's time we cut Caleb off." My husband looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Cut him off? But what about his financial situation? You know he can't afford to support Alyssa's spending habits on his own." I nodded, a grim smile spreading across my face. "Exactly. And when the money stops coming in and Alyssa starts to feel the pinch, that's when we'll make our move." Over the next few weeks, I meticulously executed my plan. I stopped the monthly transfers to Caleb's account, careful to cover my tracks and make it appear as though the funds had simply dried up. And sure enough, it didn't take long for the cracks in Alyssa's perfect little world to start showing. At first, it was just little things, complaints about having to cut back on luxury purchases or grumbling about the need to stick to a budget. But soon, those grumbles turned into full-blown tantrums, as Alyssa realized that the lavish lifestyle she had grown accustomed to was slipping through her fingers. "Caleb, what's going on?" I overheard her demand one night, her voice shrill with panic. "Why is there so little money in our accounts? We can barely afford to pay the bills this month." "I don't know, Alyssa," Caleb replied, his tone weary and defeated. "Things have just been tight at work lately. We may have to tighten our belts for a little while." But Alyssa was having none of it. She railed and raged, accusing Caleb of mismanaging their finances and threatening to leave him if he couldn't get things back on track. It was around this time that she started coming to me, her pride and ego battered, seeking handouts to sustain the lifestyle she had grown so accustomed to. "Martha, you have to help me," she pleaded, her eyes wide and desperate. "Caleb's finances are a mess, and we're barely scraping by. Surely you can spare a little money to help your daughter-in-law out?" But I remained resolute, feigning ignorance and refusing to give her a single cent. With each rejection, her desperation grew, until finally she reached her breaking point. "You miserable old hag," she screamed one day, her face twisted into a mask of rage. "I know you're behind this. You've been manipulating Caleb's finances all along, just to punish me." I simply stared back at her, my expression impassive. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Alyssa, but if you're having financial troubles, perhaps it's time you reevaluated your priorities." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her sputtering and fuming in my wake. And as I retreated to the sanctuary of my room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction wash over me. The wheels of my revenge were in motion, and there was no stopping them now. As the financial strain on Caleb and Alyssa's household intensified, the once pristine facade of their perfect life began to crumble. Alyssa, accustomed to a life of luxury, was unraveling at the seams, her desperation growing with each unpaid bill and overdue notice that piled up. Her panic reached a fever pitch one evening when she barged into the guest room where Frank and I were staying, her eyes wild and her hair disheveled. "You have to help me, Martha," she pleaded, her voice trembling with desperation. "I don't know what's going on, but we're running out of money, and I can't make ends meet." I regarded her coolly, unmoved by her histrionics. "I'm sorry, Alyssa, but I don't understand what you expect me to do. Caleb is a grown man, and it's his responsibility to provide for his family." She let out a frustrated growl, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "Don't play dumb with me, you old hag. I know you've been cutting off Caleb's income behind my back. This is all you're doing." I feigned innocence, shaking my head slowly. "I assure you, Alyssa, I have no idea what you're talking about. If you and Caleb are having financial troubles, perhaps it's time to reevaluate your spending habits." Her eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment I thought she might lash out at me physically, but instead she took a deep breath, seeming to regain some semblance of composure. "Fine," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "If that's how you want to play it, I'll just have to find another way to get the money we need." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Frank and me in stunned silence. Over the next few weeks, I watched with a mixture of satisfaction and pity as Alyssa's world crumbled around her. She tried every trick in the book to keep up appearances, maxing out credit cards, taking out loans, even pawning her jewelry and designer handbags. But no matter what she did, the financial noose just seemed to tighten around her neck. Caleb, bless his heart, tried to reason with her, suggesting that they downsize or cut back on unnecessary expenses. But Alyssa was having none of it, stubbornly clinging to the lavish lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. "We can't let them win, Caleb," she would screech, her eyes wild with desperation. "They're trying to break us, but we have to stay strong." "Who's trying to break us, Alyssa?" Caleb would reply, his voice weary and confused. "I don't understand what's going on." But Alyssa was too far gone, consumed by her own paranoia and greed. She lashed out at everyone around her, accusing them of conspiring against her, of trying to take away everything she had worked so hard for. Finally, one evening, Caleb reached his breaking point. "Alyssa, we need to talk," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sadness. This can't go on anymore." She turned to him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your spending," he replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Your obsession with money and material things. It's tearing our family apart, and I can't live like this anymore." Alyssa's face contorted with rage, and she let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I see what's going on here. Your precious mommy has finally gotten to you, hasn't she? She's been poisoning your mind against me all along." But Caleb shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, Alyssa, this isn't about my mother. This is about you and the way you've been treating everyone around you. It's toxic, and it has to stop." I watched from the shadows as the argument escalated, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when Alyssa's house of cards finally came crashing down around her. And as Caleb uttered those fateful words, I want a divorce. I couldn't help but feel a sense of twisted satisfaction. The revenge I had so carefully plotted was finally coming to fruition, and Alyssa was getting exactly what she deserved. The divorce proceedings between Caleb and Alyssa were nothing short of a spectacle, a bitter and ugly battle that laid bare the true depths of her manipulative nature. At first, Alyssa tried to play the victim, painting herself as the innocent party who had been wronged by her husband and his meddling mother. She wept crocodile tears and spun tales of emotional abuse, trying to sway the mediator to her side. "He's been brainwashed by that woman," she sobbed, gesturing dramatically towards me. "She's been poisoning his mind against me from the start, filling his head with lies and turning him against his own wife." Caleb, to his credit, remained calm and steadfast, refusing to be baited by her theatrics. "This has nothing to do with my mother, Alyssa," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is about your behavior, your constant spending, your disrespect for our family, your refusal to take any responsibility for your actions." Alyssa's eyes narrowed, and she let out a derisive snort. "Oh, please, don't act like you're some kind of saint, Caleb. We both know you've been struggling to keep up with my spending habits for years. That's why you've been taking handouts from your mommy dearest, isn't it?" A hush fell over the room, and I could see Caleb's jaw tighten as he processed her words. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned to look at me, a mixture of confusion and hurt swirling in his eyes. "Mom? Is that true?" For a moment I considered playing dumb, feigning ignorance as I had done so many times before, but something in Caleb's gaze stopped me, a silent plea for honesty, for the truth that had been kept from him for so long. So, with a heavy heart, I nodded. "Yes, Caleb, it's true. For years, I've been supplementing your income to help Alyssa maintain her lavish lifestyle, but I stopped a few months ago, and that's when everything started to unravel." Alyssa let out a triumphant cackle, her eyes dancing with vindication. "See? I told you she was behind this whole thing. She's been manipulating us from the start, trying to turn you against me." But Caleb shook his head, his expression one of weary resignation. "No, Alyssa, you're wrong. My mother may have made some questionable decisions, but she wasn't the one who brought us to this point. That was all you." Alyssa's mouth dropped open, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into fists at her sides. "How dare you talk to me like that? After everything I've done for you, for our family." "Everything you've done?" Caleb echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "Alyssa, all you've done is spend money we didn't have, disrespect my family, and make our lives a living hell with your constant demands and tantrums." He took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring as he steeled himself for what he was about to say. "That's why I'm done. I'm done with the lies, the manipulation, the constant drama. I want a divorce, and I want you out of our lives for good." The room fell silent, the weight of Caleb's words hanging heavy in the air. Alyssa's face contorted with rage, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before our very eyes. "You'll regret this, Caleb," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You and that miserable old hag will both be sorry you ever crossed me." But as she stormed out of the room, her threats ringing hollow in our ears, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The battle had been won, and Alyssa's reign of terror was finally at an end. In the weeks and months that followed, the divorce proceedings dragged on, with Alyssa fighting tooth and nail for every last penny she could squeeze out of Caleb. But in the end, her manipulations and lies caught up with her, and she was left with nothing. No money, no possessions, no family to fall back on. As for Caleb and me, our relationship slowly began to mend, the wounds of her betrayal gradually healing with time and open communication. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when I feared the rift between us might never be bridged. But in the end, the bond between a mother and her son proved stronger than any obstacle Alyssa could throw our way. And as we rebuilt our lives, free from her toxic influence, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not just for the justice that had been served, but for the chance to start anew, to build something better and more lasting than anything Alyssa had ever tried to destroy. In the aftermath of Caleb's divorce from Alyssa, a strange sense of calm settled over our lives. It was as if a dark cloud had finally lifted, allowing the warmth of a new beginning to shine through. For Caleb, the transition was not an easy one. He had spent years under Alyssa's toxic influence, and the scars of her manipulation ran deep. But with time and support from Frank and me, he slowly began to rediscover the person he had been before her, kind, hardworking, and devoted to his family. I'll never forget the day he came to me, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and resolve, and uttered the words I had been longing to hear. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen what Alyssa was doing sooner. I should have stood up for you and Dad, instead of letting her treat you both so terribly." I reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Caleb, you have nothing to apologize for. We're just grateful that you were able to break free from her hold before it was too late." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's all thanks to you, Mom. If you hadn't been so determined, so unwavering in your love for us, who knows where we'd be right now?" In that moment, I felt a swell of pride and gratitude that went beyond words. To know that my actions, as difficult and painful as they had been, had ultimately saved my son from a life of misery and turmoil, it was the greatest reward I could have ever hoped for. As the weeks turned into months, Caleb threw himself into his work, finding solace in the familiar routines and challenges of his engineering career. Gone were the days of lavish spending and empty materialism. Instead, he embraced a simpler, more grounded existence, one that allowed him to rediscover the joy in the little things. And through it all, Frank and I were there, offering our unwavering support and guidance as he navigated this new chapter of his life. We shared meals together, went on family outings, and simply enjoyed the simple pleasure of being reunited as a family once more. Of course, there were moments when the ghosts of Alyssa's cruelty would rear their ugly heads. Sometimes Caleb would grow distant or withdrawn, lost in the memories of the pain she had inflicted upon us all. And on those days, Frank and I would simply hold space for him, offering a listening ear and a shoulder to lean on whenever he needed it. As for me, I found myself grappling with a strange mix of emotions. Relief, of course, at having finally put an end to Alyssa's reign of terror, but also a lingering sense of guilt over the lengths I had gone to in order to achieve that victory. Had I gone too far? Had I allowed my own thirst for revenge to cloud my judgment, to lead me down a path that, while effective, was perhaps not entirely ethical? These were the questions that kept me up at night, weighing heavily on my conscience even as I tried to move forward and embrace the newfound peace that had been restored to our lives. But in the end, whenever I looked at Caleb, at the joy and contentment that had returned to his eyes, at the way he carried himself with a renewed sense of purpose and self-worth, I knew that I had made the right choice. Alyssa's cruelty had nearly torn our family apart, and I had simply done what was necessary to protect those I loved most. Was it messy? Absolutely. Was it always pretty or morally pristine? Certainly not. But at the end of the day, I had reclaimed my son from the clutches of a toxic, manipulative woman, and that was a victory worth any price. So as Frank and I settled into our new normal, basking in the warmth of our reunited family, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The road had been long and arduous, but we had emerged on the other side, scarred perhaps, but stronger and more resilient than ever before. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all.